Sí, también podría ser como un poco más en esta dirección. Sí.
Ah.
Sí, sí, estamos esperando a mirar para hacer la presentación. Yo voy a hacer una foto de grupo. Ahora, pues. Ella lo va a hacer. Es que no. Y tú puedes hacer una transmisión desde tu computador.
No me está funcionando, pero entonces la voy a grabar y luego la subo porque no me funcionó.
Just wait until everyone is seated. So, good evening, everybody.
Ja, das ist auch komisch, ich kenne das nicht so much. Oh, please.
Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to present to you Professor Dr. Jobst Welge. Jobst Welge is Professor for Romance Literary and Cultural Studies with a special focus on Hispanic and Lusophone studies at Leipzig University. Previously, he taught at various universities in Germany and also other countries at UC Santa Barbara, Freie Universität Berlin, University of Constance. This is where we first met. And he also held professorships in Stockholm, at Stockholm University, and before here in Eichstätt. He held the chair for Romance Literary Studies. His research interests include literature on the Amazon, literature of the Baroque and early modern periods, novel theory, and family and historical novels in the contemporary literatures of Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. Since this year, he leads the DFG scientific network, Brazilian-Italian Cultural Contact, Transatlantic Interaction and Knowledge Circulation. He has, as you can imagine, a long list of publications, of which I will only mention two volumes that he has co-edited recently. The first one is the volume Family Constellations in Contemporary Ibero-American and Slavic Literatures, Historical Imaginary, Transnationality, Narrative Form. And in 2022, he co-published the volume Literary Landscapes of Time, Multiple Temporalities and Spaces in Latin American and Caribbean Literatures. And you can see the title of his talk here. He will speak to us about Brazil, namely about reconsidering concretism in poetry and art. Arrested developments in mid-20th century Brazil. Jobst, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rian, for this generous introduction, and good evening to everybody on site and online. what an audience tonight. I'm very grateful to be back here in Eichstätt. It's always a pleasure to come here, and I'm especially grateful that this topic, it's been a while that I've been here, but actually recently Professor Brander was visiting us in Leipzig just a few days ago. So I'm very happy about this collaboration and this connection between Eichstätt and Leipzig, and about over the years the friendship and the collaboration. I'm especially grateful for this invitation to this lecture series here tonight in Eichstätt, because it forced me, or it brought me to think about the question of development in relationship to an episode in Brazilian cultural history, which raises the question how cultural development relates to economic and political development. This is, of course, not a trivial question, because many theorists of world literature and of world systems theory have alerted us to the fact that there is no easy connection. We cannot collapse the peaks of, say, economic development and cultural development. There are many examples where this might be the case, but also examples where this is not the case. Think, for instance, of the culture of the Spanish Baroque and other examples. So in other words, in order to answer this question, how does cultural development relate to economic development, we have to go case by case, and this is the case I will be trying to throw some light upon today, and hope to discuss with you. Now I have to go into the slide mode here. Sorry. This is here, no?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess.
Excuse me, Luis, could you please share your screen?
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And we doesn't work this way to go down, or
Yeah.
this way?
I guess
No?
this.
Oh, wait, okay.
Yes, this one.
Okay,
Okay.
so it's best to, yeah, it's fine, that's fine.
Okay.
This is a little tricky with this. So, okay. Let me begin with the building. The building of the Ministry for Education and Health in central Rio de Janeiro marks a symbolic starting point for the development of Brazilian modernism. It was projected in 1936, executed by a group of young Brazilian architects after a first proposal by Le Corbusier, and would become the first modernist building in Latin America when it was officially opened in 1945. The building exemplifies the typical elements of Le Corbusier's architecture. It uses the construction on pilotis, sunbreakers, a roof terrace garden, a free facade. The fact that this was, moreover, an official building caused the enthusiasm of the urban planner Lucio Costa, who maintained, "It's a fact that there exists no other public building of this character either in America, Europe, or Asia. This is an undertaking with international implications, and as such, it will take its place in the history of contemporary architecture. And it is up to each country to take this decisive step, another very important sign that we are no longer subject to external approvals," unquote. The building, then, of the ministry has indeed become a symbolic milestone for a new political will for renewal, urban utopianism, and social emancipation, a tendency that will culminate, of course, in the construction of the new capital of Brasilia in 1960, for which Lucio Costa was responsible alongside Oskar Niemeyer, the architect, and Burle Marx, the landscape architect. In the words of the then president Juscelino Kubitschek, in power from 1956 to 61, the city of Brasilia was destined to make up, quote, 50 years of development in 5 years. The opening of the new capital, projected to modernize Brazil from the high plane of its peripheral center, marked, in a sense, the culmination and final point to a decade of fervent cultural activity in the spirit of concretism. From the beginning, concretism was an international phenomenon. The term concrete art was coined in 1930 by the Dutch artist Theo van Doesburg when he started the group Art Concret in Paris. These artists were looking for a new formal idiom that was unfettered by figurative or abstract motifs. Transplanted to Brazil, concretism was enlisted to transform the social environment, to overcome underdevelopment, and to attack the dominant academic mentality in the cultural sphere. In my talk today, I first want to detail the formation of Brazilian concretism in the 1950s as associated with the city of Sao Paulo, a phenomenon that occurred in striking correspondence with the economic and social developmentalism of the 1950s. Furthermore, I want to show how the concretist movement developed towards so-called neo-concretism during the 1960s, when, broadly speaking, the political discourse in Brazil shifted towards the problem of underdevelopment. In any case, the movement of concretism, affecting all the arts from literature to visual arts to architecture, presents a fascinating case for a seemingly autonomous practice of art that nevertheless was developed in tandem or in conflict with broader societal constellations. I really have some trouble with yeah. While concrete poetry was an international phenomenon, the practice of poesia concreta was more productive and significant and of lasting impact in Brazil than anywhere else in the world. In 1958, the pilot plan for concrete poetry that you can see here was published by the brothers Augusto and Haroldo de Campos, as well as Decio Pignatari, taking up points from earlier manifestos and echoing the pilot plan of the floor plan of Brasilia. This manifesto declared the historical cycle of verse to be closed and charged the concrete poem with the communication of its own structure. The structure was its content. The poem was an object in itself, not an interpreter of exterior objects or sensations. The text of the pilot plan contains a neat definition of what concrete poetry strives to be, namely, tensão de palavras coisas no espaço-tempo, the tension of words things in space-time. In a later interview from 1992, Augusto de Campos explained this idea. I don't believe it's possible to speak of a total abolition of temporality in concrete poetry, but it's undeniable that, as far as it coincides with the materiality of language, breaking physically with the linear structure of discourse, including the imagination to organize itself by juxtaposition and coordination, parataxis, rather than by subordination, hypotaxis, and permitting a multiplicity of readings and points of view through the exploration of graphic resources. Concrete poetry interjects space into the temporality of language. It relativizes that temporality. This abolition of the temporal nature of linguistic discourse and the concomitant emphasis on the visual dimension of poetry may be exemplified by Decio Pignatari's poem Okay, it's you can see it, right? Yeah. Poem Hambre, in which the governing principle is the idea of paranomasia, which is to say the play with words varied only by single sounds. The poem consists only of 3 Spanish words, hombre, hambre, hembra, linked together not by syntax, but only by visual vectors. The poem obviously resists translation into other languages, even into Portuguese, as the minimal variance among the signifiers in this case is unique to the Spanish language. The device of paranomasia is also apparent in Augusto de Campos' poem Am I doing something wrong here? Thank you. Fluvial, which is closer to the picture poetry practiced, for instance, by Apollinaire in his collection Calligramme. The word pluvial translates as rain and drops down in single letters from above and from the right to fill the river of fluvial at the bottom of the page, to be read in the normal direction from left to the right, as you can see. The poem, in all its minimalism, brings together the material, visual, and the auditory dimensions employed in concrete poetry. Another example for the permutational play with the material signifier of the letter, in this case A and O, is Pignatari's perhaps most famous poem, Bebe Coca-Cola, Drink Coca-Cola, from 1957, initially published in the 4th issue of the journal Neugandres, which mimics the language of consumer culture and simultaneously criticizes it. Again, the procedure of the poem is suggesting that the words themselves contain already all the possibilities brought out by the anagrammatic permutation of letters. While the brand name Coca-Cola is associated with US imperialism and conflates the signifier with the product, the transformation into the word cloaca, shit, deflates this conjunction in favor of a material signified that appears as the abject and real underside of the advertisement slogan, as in the Baroque structure of Desengaño. But yet again, this revelation does not cancel the joyful promise contained in the first line and the general purpose to enter into a feedback loop with the urban environment of street science and communication, and of the communication between the artist and a possibly broader public. The idea of concrete poetry was variously inspired by the high modernist experiments of Apollinaire, Mallarmé, James Joyce, Mayakovsky, and E. Cummings, but also by the Brazilian poets Oswald de Andrade and especially João Cabral de Melo Neto, and the latter's predilection for objects and architecture that is also exemplified by his avoidance of the subject in poetry and his preference for poetics of the stone with a pared down language and the preference for substantives over verbs. In short, by drawing on these different lineages within Western literature, the Brazilian concretists proclaimed a poetics that flew in the face of the paradigm of expressionist subjectivity that has characterized the mainstream of the Western lyric since its inception, as Guido Mazzoni has argued in his book on modern poetry. The concretist poems, as exemplified in Augusto de Campos' Poeta Menos from 1953, privileged instead impersonality, shape, and the materiality of language. In 1956, the movement of concrete poetry was officially launched as part of the National Exposition of Concrete Art at the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo. This official act for the institution of the new movement echoed the famous Week of Modern Art from 1922 in Sao Paulo, which perhaps some of you know, and which also tried to negotiate the relationship between cosmopolitanism and the vernacular. It is from here that concrete poetry begins its career, even if the idea of concrete poetry may be traced back to the year 1933, when a manifesto for concrete poetry was already issued by the Swedish-Brazilian artist Oyvind Fahlström. Augusto de Campos himself has suggested that concrete poetry was an artistic response to emerging communication media during this period, and thus expressed a kind of contemporary forma mentis imposed by posters, slogans, headlines that makes urgent the rapid communication of cultural objects. The poets of this group called themselves Neugandres, after an enigmatic word by the Provençal poet Arnaud Daniel, as cited in the cantos of Ezra Pound, another central influence for the concretist poets, especially because of his use of ideograms in the cantos. This orientation toward technology in a rapidly industrializing country was soon tinged by the perception of the hegemony of industrialized nations versus the underdeveloped condition of Brazil. Haroldo de Campos later sought to disassociate the poetic project from the political program of the Kubitschek years, likely because the regime was then seen under the sign of failure. And this is a quotation from him. The connection with developmentalism that characterized Kubitschek's administration were used by criticism of a sociological orientation as an allegory in an attempt to identify artificially the cosmopolitanism of concrete poetry with such facts as the implantation of an automotive industry in Brazil by multinational companies. It was a demagogic comparison that aimed at representing the protagonists of concrete poetry antipathetically as reactionaries or entreguistas, in the sense that development is the delivery, entrega, of the wealth of the nation for the exploration of foreign capital, at a moment in which the demands of the nationalists were in ascendance again. The military dictatorship that was installed in Brazil sanctioned this negative vision of Kubitschek, in spite of his having been exiled, and in connection with this view maintained a preconception against the poetry of his era. Today, after the collapse of the Marxist utopia, the same Kubitschek is viewed with other, more positive eyes. Yet during the 1950s, the concretist agenda was heavily marked by utopian and messianic tones that echoed the general atmosphere. Both art and economy were entrusted with the miraculous capacity to leap out of its condition of underdevelopment. The tendencies in concrete poetry were paralleled in the realm of the visual arts, as exemplified by the vanguard formations of the Grupo Frente and Ruptura. The latter group was established explicitly with the aim to introduce a rupture into the sphere of Brazilian visual art, which, even in its most modernist manifestations, was firmly wedded to figural representation, as for instance in the paintings by Portinari, and hence to an explicitly national content. The inaugural exhibition for this group was held in 1952 at the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo, when it was accompanied by a manifesto which proclaimed in a typical avant-garde gesture the primacy of the new over the old, stating that there is no continuity. Não há mais continuidade, as you can see there. The group Ruptura, heavily influenced by Swiss designer Max Bill, consisted of a total of 7 artists, mostly of non-Brazilian origin, and counted among its members the Italian-born Valdemar Cordeiro, who was born in Rome in 1925 and had settled in Brazil after the war, while maintaining strong connections to the post-war abstractionist movements in Italy, notably the Rome Art Club and the Milan-based group around the journal Forma, which in fact anticipated the Brazilian orientation towards the concrete, partly under the influence of the 19th century German philosopher Konrad Fiedler, who had already promoted the idea of an object-like poem, and partly by the model of Russian constructivism as a paradigm for revolutionary art. In the area of visual art, Cordeiro was strongly influenced by a landmark exhibition in Milan, Arte Astratta e Concreta, which was co-organized by Max Bill in 1947, destined to become a major name in the international circuit of concrete art. Cordeiro's stature as a theorist and practitioner of concrete art is increasingly valued, as evidenced by the first solo exhibition in Britain earlier this year. Gradually abandoning vestiges of figuration in his artistic practice, throughout the 1950s, he was regarded as the foremost exponent of a technological concrete aesthetic. In the Ruptura Manifesto and in other theoretical writings of the early 1950s, Cordeiro insists on a teleological understanding of art history, culminating in the idea of art as a form of knowledge, a form of objectivized art he then came to call concrete, and which he opposed to the notion of art as expression. This teleological program was even supported by a Marxist framework insofar as the expressionist tendency was relegated to a feudal phase of art, whereas the new art of creation allowed for qualitative leaps, as he called it. Cordeiro's own paintings typically suppress any movements or traces of the artist's hand, of the pencil, and instead are executed with the help of rulers or compasses. In various of his artworks, Cordeiro inscribed patterns of rotating circles, conceived to visualize mathematical principles and ratios, geometrical organization, and standardization of forms. In any event, the process of production was relegated to a second plane. What counted was the result of the finished product. Following ideas by the second-generation Italian futurist Enrico Prampolini, Cordeiro advocated the technique of polymateriality, by which he understood a sort of merging between painting and sculpture. He thus aimed at the ideal of an organic unity that would dissolve the boundaries between design, painting, sculpture, art, and architecture, all united by the inscription of geometric patterns, a principle that was programmatically opposed to the two-dimensionality of easel painting. Following Prampolini, Cordeiro argues in favor of an integrated understanding of visual art. Thus, he writes, "The younger generation condemns in easel painting the triumph of the fragment, of a literary motif, in favor of the panel's function in its setting, not considered as extraneous in relation to architecture, nor as a servile aspect of its environment." By transposing these ideas to the new context of Brazil and by invoking also the authority of Le Corbusier, Cordeiro thus introduces a democratizing element. Fascination with the machine, he writes, led to the demise of naturalistic beauty. The artist forged a new language that can express the individual, the collective, the national, and the universal all at the same time. Therefore, we may observe that even the seemingly orthodox version of concrete art represented by Cordeiro contains already elements of opening up, of intervening in public space, of imbricating art in its setting, elements, in short, that are regarded as typical for the neo-concretism of the 1960s. In a playground for the Clube Esperia, a predominantly Italian social club in Sao Paulo, Cordeiro integrated sculptural concretism and landscape design, as you can see here. For this playground, Cordeiro transformed the regular geometries of concretism into physical structures over which children could climb and hang. Yet even in transforming what was, in both his concretist works and landscape designs, a planar practice to three dimensions, Cordeiro played with the possibility of different perceptions of the plane. Cordeiro thus applied principles of geometric abstraction to shared urban space to create staging grounds for new human relationships, which amounts to a resolutely modernist project. Especially with this trajectory of Cordeiro, it is not possible to reduce concretism to a mere mirror image of developmentalism. However, it is possible to identify a development within concretism, namely a development that moved away from commodification and the idea of art as self-sufficient objects towards an idea of art as process that involved the participation of the beholder and that acknowledged the conditions of social context. The Rio-based poet and art critic Ferreira Goulart, who had himself joined the movement of concrete poetry and who acknowledged that the Brazilian concrete poets, in contrast to the visual artists, were in fact able to surpass and had the tendencies of the European avant-garde, later criticized what he saw as the self-illusions of this project in his book Avant-Garde and Underdevelopment from 1969. Poetic concretism is the re-emergence of international avant-garde trends, but with a character that did not exist in plastic concretism. Brazilian concrete poetry aims to be a step forward in the international avant-garde itself, the development of the experiences of Pound and Joyce. Concretism reflects on the part of its theoreticians and promoters the ignorance of a basic fact, that there is no perfect cultural equivalence between developed and underdeveloped countries, since the process of formation and development of these countries is not identical and their respective problems differ. And in fact, we know that the 1950s witnessed not only a rapid development of an export-oriented economy, foreign investment, nationally produced automobiles, and the construction of highways connecting the immense territory of the country, but that during this time, the urban regeneration and the artistic liberation was restricted to a small minority of the population. As Rafael Lloris writes in an essay published in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy, the alleged unity around national development that purportedly characterized the period would not be capable of disguising the intense process of class differentiation and uneven development that eventually culminated in the institutional rupture of the early 1960s, which heralded 21 long years of military dictatorship. Now, as we move into the period after the coup of 1964, the production of concrete art continues, yet becomes more process and performance oriented and increasingly involves the aspect of the body and of space. In the parlance of Ferreira Goulart, this period of culture, moving now from Sao Paulo to Rio de Janeiro and from poetry increasingly to visual art, will become the epoch of the non-object. In 1959, the Manifesto Neoconcreto, authored by Goulart and signed by other artists such as Franz Weissmann, Ligia Clark, and Ligia Pape, was published in the Jornal do Brasil, and it began with the following words. The term neoconcrete refers to a standpoint before non-figurative geometrical art, neoplasticism, constructivism, suprematism, the school of Ulm, and specifically before the concrete art, which has been driven into an ever more dangerous rationalism. The text continued by stating, that in an artistic context, geometrical forms lose their objective character and instead become bearers for fantasy. And moreover, it emphasizes the spatializing quality of art, which is why neoconcrete art strives after an expressive function of space, affecting both the process of its production and its reception. Moreover, Goulart published the seminal essay Theory of the Non-Object, which emphasized the role of the reader in the perception of poetry and questioned the fetishization of objecthood. It was directly taken up by the artists identifying with neo-concretism and remains a fundamental key for interpretation until today. In Goulart's view, the non-object amounted to a sort of artistic appearance that occurred when objects were disentangled from their habitual and pragmatic contexts. He writes, when we withdraw from the cultural order of the world, we see objects without their names and we come face to face with their opacity as thing. One could say that in these circumstances, the object becomes close to what I call the non-object. Furthermore, he stated, the spectator is solicited to use the non-object. Mere contemplation is not enough to reveal the sense of the work. The spectator goes from contemplation to action. But what this action produces is the work itself, because that use, foreseen in the structure of the work, is absorbed by it, revealed and incorporated into its signification. As for the case of concrete poetry, Goulart reintroduced the notion of subjective experience and temporality, also in the sense of the use of verbal forms, which had been banished by the orthodox understanding of concretism. 1959 was also the year that witnessed the first exhibition of neo-concrete art in the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro. Also, other artists around the mid-1960s emphasized the processual nature of art, the activization of art objects in the sense of collective participatory art. Oh dear. No, I'm off. Very sensitive.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
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 Okay, one.
This. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, you just state and then go one further.
Yeah. Let me sure I want to search the where to share your screen.
Aha. So
Okay,
it's
here.
off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here. Okay, I'm stopping of my. Let's finish this. It's.
Und dann jetzt eins weitermachen.
Genau.
Aber jetzt geht's wieder. Jetzt.
This. Genau.
Welche haben die jetzt gemacht? Diesen.
Ja.
Diesen.
Eine von diesen.
Der. Okay, das ist okay. Okay, doch. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you. Also, other artists around the mid-1960s emphasized the processual nature of art, the activization of art objects in the sense of collective participatory art, as exemplified by the Objetos Activos by Willy de Castro, which changed their appearance according to the angle of shadows thrown on the wall. Cut off, okay. This tendency was exemplified by two prominent artists of this time who have transformed and expanded the idea of concrete art, now dubbed neo-concretism, Elio Oiticica and Ligia Clark. Ligia Clark, in her attempt to criticize mechanistic thought in art, such as the reliance on Gestalt theory in concretism, was attracted to speculations about non-Euclidean geometries in the form of the Möbius strip. For this figure, this works much better now. It works there. For this figure, she was influenced by the model of Max Bill, the Swiss representative of concretism, who was also associated with the Bauhaus in Dessau. During the year 1953, when he founded the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, he twice visited Brazil, where he attempted to help found a similar school for design. Bill had an enormous influence on the development of Brazilian art and design during this period, and even to other areas of Latin America. Bill proposed the function of concrete art as an expansion of sensibilities which demanded the preservation of the artwork's aura. The unknown areas of reality will be approached by mathematical means, as he argued in a text called Mathematical Thought in the Art of Our Time. Die mathematische Denkweise in der Kunst unserer Zeit. Human thinking in general and mathematical thinking in particular need, in the face of the unlimited, a visual support. This is where art comes in. From this point onward, the clear line becomes indefinite, while abstract, invisible thinking arises as concrete and visible. Unknown spaces, nearly unbelievable axioms, acquire reality and begin to move through regions where they did not exist previously. Sensibility is enlarged. Spaces that were until recently unknown and unimaginable begin to be known and imagined. The recurrent use of the Möbius strip in the practice of Brazilian artists in the decades following Max Bill's exhibitions and visits to Brazil suggest that alongside introducing constructivism's rational ideas, the Swiss artist also opened pathways for the emergence of a more phenomenological and relational version of his aesthetic and social proposition. The formation of the Movimento Concretista in Rio de Janeiro around the Grupo Frente, led by artist and professor Ivan Serpa, included artists who did not necessarily practice geometric abstraction. Serpa had a reputation as both an emergent abstract artist and an art teacher for children, so he would have also shared the understanding that art and creativity should not be regarded as the exclusive province of artists. This unorthodox characteristic of the Rio de Janeiro group, coupled with the interest in subjectivity and a concern for the figure of the other, led it to a greater freedom in relation to Max Bill's ideas and consequently to the formation of the neo-concrete group in 1959, where artists like Lygia Clark bestowed a new direction and meaning to its premises. In the work of Clark and also in the work of Elio Oiticica, we can observe the adoption of the fold as a material and spatial strategy to question the relationship between inside and outside, to critique conventional representation and the traditional pictorial support, and hence to mediate the relation between subject and object in a more fluid way. For instance, we may encounter the structure of the fold in a series of works by Clark called bichos, beasts, that are metal sculptures that viewers were asked to unfold. So these sculptures could take on, in principle, an infinity of different forms. They deconstruct the idea of the fixed object. They are conceived, in Clark's words, as living organisms, as female organisms, as structures that are somehow enfolding a void, as in a snail, which is an image or metaphor she uses. Inspired by contemporary psychoanalytical theory, Lygia Clark writes in her diary of 1963, I quote, "How can I feel that I am a total unity if precariousness, permanent movement is the essence of my work and has therefore become mine also? I am crying over the fixed, which has no meaning anymore, instead of accepting the precarious in the greatest joy as a concept of existence. Especially interesting is the hand dialogue, Diálogo dos Maus, which you see on the right, of 1966, which she performed together with Elio Oiticica. The image literally encapsulates their close collaboration during these years. The procedure, which required two participants, run risk of each penetrating the two loops of an elastic Möbius strip, questioned the notion of the constructivist object produced by principles of rationality. Once inside the loop, the hands twisting produced a feeling of inevitability and irresolution. Expression was mooted, and the hands perform a sort of autonomous movement, illustrating the notion of self-presence, so dear to the phenomenological discourse. Also, the cutting of the Möbius strips involved direct action, in this case, the cutting of the strip with scissors. If I use the Möbius strip for this experience, Clark wrote, it is because it breaks our spatial habits, right, left, obverse, reverse, etc. It makes us live the experience of a limitless time and a continuous space, unquote. Clark's practices solicit not only participation, they aim at a subversion of the subject, the activation of one's division, in relation to oneself, which corresponds to an opening to the other. More than simply integrating the spectator, the work displays a concomitant desire to dilute the artist's very subjectivity, undoing the separation between artist and non-artist, work and object. So in these objects or non-objects, rather, she privileges action over object. She says that these performances of objects allow her to feel a global sentiment. This idea of presentism becomes very important, so it's no longer conceived to be messianic. And also, these artworks exemplify an abdication of authorship, so that the idea of the artist, the author of an artwork, is no longer the genius who conceives something. So in that sense, I think this idea resonates with certain ideas ventilated in literary criticism or literary theory of the 1960s by Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, etc. For Clark and also Ferreira Goulart, the aesthetics of the non-object was related less to man's function as a social and economic agent, but to an almost existentialist vision of man and art in a horizon of totality. The phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, for instance, is a major reference point for Goulart. In that sense, expressive intention and hence the dimension of subjectivity as banished by the orthodox vision of concretism was restored to the work of art. Of course, this progressive vision of neo-concretism was made possible by a brief period in which a liberal bourgeoisie in Brazil was functioning as a stand-in for a presumably undifferentiated universal subject before the establishment of the military dictatorship in 1964 brought this period to an end and drove Oiticica into exile. Goulart and Oiticica had even championed a popular revolutionary art that would, in the latter's words, produce spiritual weapons for the material and cultural liberation of our people, unquote. Famously, Oiticica's most iconic artistic conception, the wearable mantles of the so-called parangolés, were worn in samba schools, in which also Oiticica was actively participating and were seen as continuous with the urban structure of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. Oiticica had arrived at this phase of ever more ephemeral objects by his own manipulation of the concretist vocabulary, destabilizing its convention and reliance on preconceived geometrical structures, subscribing to the idea of color as embodied rather than represented light, while working with suspended, colorful geometrical forms that maintained a last connection with the practice of painting, but had increasingly ventured away from the museum wall, soliciting the spatial involvement of the beholder and also exemplifying this idea of the fold that I mentioned before. As we have seen, the movement of neo-concretism holds on to the idea of the autonomy of art, yet it attributes a decisive role to the beholder in the construction of the meaning of the artwork, not through determining that meaning, but in activating it through a more participatory understanding of the function of art. Yet, as Rachel Price shows in her book, The Object of the Atlantic, the apparent rift between 1950s concretism and 1960s neo-concretism betrays, in fact, a broad sense of continuity, even if we, as we acknowledge, shifts in emphasis from contemplation into action, autonomy to involvement, aesthetics to politics. And I think this becomes clear if we look at the individual careers of Valdemar Cordeiro and Elio Oiticica, which I have here presented as being representative, the one for the 1950s, Cordeiro, the one for the 1960s, Oiticica. But in each case, we see that they evolve or develop from a more sort of stable geometrical vocabulary into a more holistic or performative quality. So this is one example for this what Rachel for this continuity between what appears to be two different movements, concretism and neo-concretism. The underlying assumption for the concretist movements, also not schematized on the level of the works themselves, was a vision of national emancipation and development, a development that was also understood as a development internal to the discipline of painting. But as neo-concretism developed a different understanding of and commitment to the real, the movement ran into an impasse as conflictual politics were overtaking the progressive model of development as it had emerged during the 1950s. Despite this arrested development, concrete poetry and art remain one of the most significant and original manifestations of Brazilian culture. And thanks to its international reception, it fulfills Oswald de Andrade's modernist call to produce a literature ready for export. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. And we have now time for several rounds of questions and commentaries. I suggest that we start with a round here in Eichstätt, and later we pass to Bogota and the virtual space. So are there any questions?
But maybe to animate the others to talk. I have not a specific question, but I have a comment about what I learned today hearing you. Thank you for your presentation. And what resulted interesting for me was to contrast what you present today with the other utopias, other movements that in Latin America today. And it's interesting how to see how the questions of utopias and the questions of development was circulated without critic in many political perspectives. And there was a common element, this idea that the utopia should be geometrical in some way. And today we have others metaphors to talk about utopias to the critics or to narrate development. About emotions, for example, or the metaphors or rhizomas or rhizomatic constructions, the post-development, the constructivism, all these things is interesting, and I learned that is very interesting how has changed these utopias and these perspectives of modernists in that time compared to today, where are more diverse. There are more other narratives circulating, not only in poetry, but in others, in social movements. And this is for me interesting to how to contrast what you present, what is happening today. Maybe one question is, if how was that connected with social movements, for example? There's one connection in some way, or not?
Thank you. That's a very good point, because in fact, it's very difficult to talk about social or political applications in a kind of art form, if you look at the visual art, that is seemingly completely devoid of content, completely abstract, and seemingly also completely apolitical. So even the sense of utopia, as you mentioned, which has such strong resonances in many different Latin American countries, what do we mean by utopia here if we have these artworks and these poems that are not utopian in any sort of direct or explicit sense? In the 1950s, perhaps only the group of Ruptura, in which Cordeiro participated, this was a group, as I said, composed mostly of men, artists of foreign extraction, so from different European countries. And they had, many of them, most of them, I think, had a sort of vaguely Marxist orientation. So here we have very early, coming out of the Italian and European sort of after-war situation, a kind of Marxist current that was already very sophisticated in the sense that it understood Marxism in the sense of a dialectical understanding of form. But this was, I think, by and large a minority in the concretist current of the 1950s. So what we see then is that paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, as the dictatorship arose, the years before the coup at least, we have an increasing politicization of the concretists, who often, as in the case of Lygia Clark and Elio Ortisica, came out of this movement. But then, as I showed here with some examples, had, in the spirit of 1968, of the 1960s, understood these artworks. I mean, there's a famous, I don't know whether you're familiar with Brazilian popular culture, but there's a famous, I think it's even a CD cover, famous Brazilian singer Gaetano Veloso, who has in one of the CDs, he wears one of these parangolés or these sequins. So it even goes into pop culture, but also reaches a broader public in the 1960s in this kind of social movement of liberation, of freedom and so forth. So as we moved into the 60s, we have an increasing politicization, not necessarily in the sense of a utopia, but in the sense of an awareness of social problems and an acknowledgement of the problems of the audience, which could never be completely solved, I presume. But at least the artworks and also there were few poems in the 1960s of great interest, but at least the visual art was more overtly political. So and reached, at least in some sense, a broader audience, and was, so one of these editions of Concrete Poetry reached, thousands of editions and was widely distributed. So there was a certain popularity associated with concretism as we moved into the 1960s.
Okay.
There are 3 more questions. Maybe we can collect them, and would that be okay? Marie, and Sergey.
So let's start. Thank you a lot for the talk. I learned a lot, and I was always thinking about another manifesto when I heard about the manifesto from the Grupo Cultura. I remember about the manifesto anthropophagico, and I hear some reference about Oswald, and I think Mario Andrade as well. I'm not sure about the second. And so my question is about that. The manifesto of Grupo Cultura, for example, presents more simplistic arguments for breaking with the Renaissance art or the naturalist art, my opinion, claiming to build something new. But many things had already been created in the world of art, including Brazilian art since then. For example, the art advocated by the Manifesto Anthropophagico. Manifesto Anthropophagico was written in 1922, so 30 years before. Seems to be, so this Manifesto Anthropophagico seems to be more provocative and call for change in a way that's more perhaps urgently and radical. And the manifesto of Grupo Cultura sounds a little bit monotonous. And I'm thinking about the historical moments of the 2 texts. And in the same time, the comforting that came a little bit time after, like from written and presented by Ferreira Goulart and Elio Tisica, shows a comforting in a more radical way and more rebellion way, I don't know. So my question is going to this point. Makes sense to compare the both texts, and as well if this is really monotonous or I'm not catching the text well.
Thank you. Yeah. But we should collect the questions.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with these topics of poetry. I have a question related to what happened with the military coup with these artists. Have they problems to stay in their country, in Brazil? Or have they finished their arts, went they to other places or changed? Was there a change? So it's more to hear about what happened after the military with this kind
Yeah.
of artists.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the third question by Sergey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sil, for this presentation. You presented the concretism as a sort of universal and maybe global movement with the possibility to attach yourself to this movement from every point of the world. And well, besides all the translation problems that are obvious. But my question is the very role of Brazil in this whole, let's say, assemblage of ideas and persons. Was it for you mostly a receptacle for, like, follow-up question to this, receptacle for European fashions? What was the let's say transatlantic synergy there? According to you. And the second question is, I'm really curious what became out of the whole movement. I mean, you helped us to understand the continuity from, let's say, suprematism and modernism, and you drew a line to the neo-concretism. But I'm asking myself, what's the phase of concretism nowadays beyond a museum interest or beyond mere, let's say, academic interest? What became of it? Because looking at it, I don't know if you will coincide, it seems, well, it seems not old-fashioned, but it seems something that falls out of time.
Okay.
That's not contemporary anymore. So, the question of the heritage, maybe.
Yeah, very good. These three
So I
questions,
think
yeah,
we can
great.
answer now.
I'd love to keep track of here. Yeah, thank you very much for the all very pertinent questions. First of all, the genre of the manifesto. What was your name?
My name is Maria.
Maria. Of course, as you know, the manifesto is a prototypical genre of the avant-garde or of the avant-gardes. And there are studies, one very interesting by Martin Puchner, who has studied sort of all the different manifestos that have been written in the 1920s or in the first decades of the 20th century of Dadaism and Surrealism and so forth. So if you found an avant-garde, you need a manifesto. So there's a very pragmatic reason to have a manifesto. And as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, there is, of course, a self-conscious gesture. I mean, there are only two movements of this kind in the Brazilian cultural history in the 20th century, namely the Week of Modern Art with the Manifesto Antropófago from 1922, and then the concretist manifestos. So in that sense, they self-consciously inscribe themselves into this movement, which more than in any other country I know is part of the, I mean, you have learned about anthropophagia in Brazilian school, right? Which is not the case for, I mean, in German schools, you don't learn about the Dadaism necessarily, right? So in other words, the Manifesto Antropófago has become a part of kind of the national self-understanding of culture precisely because the anthropophagic metaphor means that you incorporate something coming from outside, something European, as Sergey suggested, in this kind of transatlantic relation, and then make it your own, transform it, make it new, right? So in that sense, the significance and also the poetic quality of the Manifesto Antropófago are unsurpassed and are not rivaled by these manifestos. I completely agree with you. I think that the manifesto, if you want to call it one of the Plano Piloto, which I showed at the second slide, is much more elaborate than the Manifesto Ruptura, which is really just, how did you say, monotonous or sort of, I mean, simplistic in a sense, even almost parodic. I mean, we condemn the old, we want the new. I mean, that's almost banal if you're an avant-garde. The Plano Piloto is more interesting because it really creates a kind of literary genealogy out of mostly European models to be adapted in the Brazilian context, Joyce, Mayakovsky, and so forth. So there is also, this is also very unusual for Brazilian literature, that the theoretical writings around the production of poetry is almost more substantial than the poetry itself. So that's to say that manifestos, theoretical writings, are sort of widely discussed, and there are lots of texts available. So there's a strong need to make all these claims and to this claim for renewal. But I agree that the Ruptura Manifesto is not very significant as a text. But I think what counts is a gesture, that you have these moments in which you still create avant-gardes. And this, of course, also connects with the question by Sergei. That is to say, today, there is, even back in the 1960s or 70s, there is this famous essay by the German poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger, which I think is called The Aporias of the Avant-Garde, where he basically argued that the whole gesture of the avant-garde, which is to create the totally new, has become old-fashioned and anachronistic, right? Back in, I think it was in the late 1960s when he wrote this essay, Aporias of the Avant-Garde. So this is something to think about if we think about a country like Brazil in the 20th century, to what extent, or even, in the same moment where the Swiss concretism, and Switzerland was actually an important country here in this context. In the very same moment where Swiss concretism came to an end or was exhausted, Max Bill became very popular and influential, at least in Brazil. So again, we have this problem of, is there a kind of retardation in the peripheral context, or is there a stronger need for renewal in a cultural context where we have, a very academic culture and a very sort of rigid tradition and so forth. So these things sort of are, the two questions are connected. The genre of the manifesto, the gesture to call for an avant-garde, to what extent is it necessary or has a greater effect in this particular geographical and political situation. I don't know whether this answered your question. Then thank you for your question with the military coup. I haven't actually traced all the biographies of the different artists. What I know is that Elio Oiticica, who died very young, I think in his early 40s, he emigrated like Gaetano Veloso for a few years to England and then to New York, where I think he died. So in his case, and he was the most politically outspoken artist of these concretist artists, he actually went into exile, as some of these musicians and other writers and intellectuals did during this time. This is, however, as far as I know, not the case for the Campos brothers, the two most well-known exponents of concretist poetry, who even were well known in academic circles worldwide up until the 1990s. And Augusto de Campos, I believe, is still alive in his early 90s, I think. So, in other words, they didn't emigrate. They continued to write and publish, as far as I know, during the dictatorship. And of course, here we have the question, if you have this kind of literature or literary activity that is concretism or that is concrete poetry, how should a censor act in this case? It's literature where you can always say, if needs is, you can always say it's completely apolitical. Okay. So in that sense, I think they didn't have, particular problems to kind of maneuver around these years, But it's a complex question, of course, and I can't give you a better informed answer. It's okay, unfortunately. Yeah, and Sergei, this is of course a very complex, several questions. You asked for the global, also the national versus the global association in the transatlantic.
Yeah, I was thinking mostly about Maria's question about the role of Brazil And what is there in Brazil when you take away
Yeah, right. So I mean, I thought about this a lot, because it's a question that always occurs in talking about Brazilian, Latin American culture. To what extent is the influence of Europe paramount or not? And the conventional wisdom is that you say that this first phase, that is to say, concretism, was more a kind of mimicry or sort of adaptation, importation of a European vocabulary, which adapted these principles of strict rationality and so forth. Whereas the second phase, that is to say, the neo-concretism became more explicitly Brazilian in the sense that it that it became more original, as I showed in the works of Ligia Clark and so forth, and even incorporated elements as in the Parangolés by Oiticica, but also the architect Lina Bobardi, who incorporated elements of the culture of the Brazilian Northeast and so forth. So, I mean, I think you can broadly say that in the 1960s, artists generally, architects included, paid more attention to the local contexts of the time. Of course, this is a question that you can pursue in many different directions. I mean, look at a city like Brasilia, where the Brazilian government is still today, and it's on one hand, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, a sort of radically cosmopolitan international style, if you will. But on the other hand, he tries, even as a modernist, as an avant-gardist, he tries to find a kind of Brazilian language that is somehow unique. But it's a complex question. And in the poetry, as you said, I mean, it's on one hand, if you reduce poetry to words and you say the patterns or the parameters of a poem is nothing but the word, which you in the Coca-Cola and so forth, then of course the words are unique and you cannot. It's almost impossible to translate it. So in that sense, there is a very strong local or linguistic element there. But as I try to gesture at the end, it's paradoxical that I ended on this note, that it's paradoxical that of all different kinds of Brazilian literature, from the 19th to the century to the 20th century, I mean, there's perhaps no phenomenon that has been so much not translated, but I'd say sort of exported into, of course, mainly academic and artistic circles, granted, but it has become a huge international success. If you look at the numbers of studies, if you look at the numbers of exhibitions to this day, as I mentioned, this year in London, Cordeiro exhibition. So there is a huge international appeal. And during the 1980s, especially, there was a new re-evaluation of the concretist movement. But even today, we see a renewed interest, of course, mostly in academic and artistic circles, but also in question of design and so forth. But it's a question that is perhaps the most pressing, but also the most challenging. To what extent concretism negotiates this tension between the local or the vernacular and the universal or the cosmopolitan.
So thank you for this first round. And now we will see if there are any questions from Bogota or from the digital space. Andres, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Miriam. Thank you. And thank you, Jobst. It's very nice to see you again. I don't know if you remember me from
Yes.
old Eichstätt times. I think we left Eichstätt at the same time, and it's really nice to see you again. Thank you, of course, for this wonderful presentation. And I have two questions. The first one is very easy to ask, but I don't think it is very easy to answer. or to answer in a short way, and it has to do with concretism's conception of time, because you mentioned that temporality was an issue for concretism, as well as spatiality, but that's another question. And since time is an essential aspect of development and of development conceptions, I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little further on this relationship. And the second question is, again, since concretism and neo-concretism are so closely related to discussions on underdevelopment, and these discussions on the social sciences were in large part the result of intellectual networks. Were there also artistic or literary networks that originated in Brazil and that expanded in Latin America or in the global South? This would be the two questions, Jobst.
Yeah, thank you very much on this. These are indeed large questions. As for the time and temporality question, again, if you look at the two different phases, the orthodox phase of concretism tries to do away with time, to aim at an ideal spatiality where you have nothing but the words on the page and almost abolish time. Whereas the second phase was neo-concretism, deliberately sort of reintroduces temporality in the process of production, as in these folding and the scissors, but also the act of beholding or of perceiving a work of art in the visual or in the literary sense. So in that sense, it works as a kind of internal dynamic. I mean, avant-garde art always tries to go into a very radical direction and tries to do away with something and to abolish something. I mean, this kind of negative rhetoric you have in the Futurist Manifesto, for instance, by Marinetti, everything has to be abolished. So once you have abolished everything, you need to reconstruct things. So there's a kind of internal dynamic where the pendulum, swings in the other direction. So I think it might be interesting to see the necessity or the sort of ripening or the deepening of concretist art and this reaction to an extreme that one has chosen, and then you can go no longer further into this very extreme direction. I mean, you all know that you have this the Malevich, the black painting. I mean, you cannot. I mean, if you reach the extreme of abstract art, I mean, how can you go any further, and so forth and so forth. So there's a kind of internal aporia, to quote Enzensberger, within what you can do in the avant-garde. Of course, the question of temporality is closely related to the question of development or developmentalism. The question is in what way? Here, paradoxically, perhaps, because we associate, developmentalism with progress and hence with linearity, right? But paradoxically, this reintroduction of temporality actually occurs in a moment when people like Lygia Clark turn to the idea of presentism. That is to say, the idea of a utopia, of a Marxist utopia, of a social utopia, is no longer, at least in her case, no longer a viable path. So in that sense, again, we have a situation where the temporality or the temporal structure of the artwork does not necessarily automatically correspond with the idea of progress or development in a historical or political sense. So I don't know whether this answers your question. Your second question was the networks and the ramifications in the global South, right? So did you mean by this how Brazilian concretism was then perceived in other Latin American countries, or
Yes, how it was perceived, but or was it a part of a larger development in the whole global south? Were there other manifestations of analog tendencies in
yeah,
other
yeah.
locations in the global south?
Yeah, I'm obviously not a major expert in this field, and the Brazilian case is the one that I certainly know best, and I can recommend this book by Rachel Price, which which is called The Object of the Atlantic, and which has 3 different case studies, namely Brazil, Cuba, and Spain, and also Argentina and Uruguay, so the Cono Sur. They have also had a concretist movement within painting specifically. I think no other country has had such a big movement in literature. So, but in the visual arts, the countries I named have had their own networks and avant-garde movements. And as I mentioned briefly, Max Bill had a huge influence in various Latin American countries. So this is if you're interested in these sort of continental ramifications, I can recommend the book by Price, which gives an overview of these different cases. To what extent they are sort of connected is not entirely clear to me. In the case of the Brazilian artists, they had a very intense phase of cooperation, with Europe. I mean, especially with Ulm, with the Hochschule für Gestaltung, with Gomringer, with Bill. So I'm more aware of these sort of European connections, but there might be also contacts with other Latin American countries. But yet again, I mean, there are other countries, but it's notable that no other concretist movement has had the same stature and the same influence as the Brazilian case.
Thank you.
So if you allow me, I would align with that question about the broader context of Latin America. As you said, concrete art or concretism became a product of export from Brazil to the world. And well, more or less at the same time, other Latin American countries also produced another product, which is magical realism. And there we have a similar movement. The concept comes from Europe. It is adapted in the Latin American context and then re-exported.
Yeah.
So my question would be, why does Brazil go a different way? Why is it concrete art, which is reproduced in Brazil? Does it have to do with the political context, with these discourses of development?
Yeah, that's a very good question, precisely because the two parallel phenomena that you mentioned, magical realism and concretism, are on the surface, I mean, completely different. I mean, magical realism is kind of, I mean, you might call it an exoticizing strategy or a self-exoticizing strategy. It's, obviously applies to, big novels, usually, Garcia Marquez and so forth. So it's in its content and its form, it's a complete opposite of concretism. So therefore, it's an interesting comparison. I think, and you're right, that there is no, I mean, Brazil did not participate. There's, some Brazilian fantastic, but there's no, it has been no magical realism in Brazil. Why is that so? And, why is concretism, kind of the expert phenomenon? Of course, I myself called it an expert phenomenon, but of course on a different level, because as you know, the magical realism export, as Gesine Müller and others studied, has been a huge publishing and translation success. And there you have all these dozens of translations into other languages and huge numbers of, bestsellers and so forth and so forth. All of this is not, exactly the case with concrete poetry, of course. But the interesting question is, of course, why does apparently Brazil or Brazilian artists want to project this image of themselves and not, say, an exoticizing or magical realist image? And I think this has to do with the fact that the movement originated in the city of Sao Paulo, which at that time, to some extent, even today, is or was the only and largest Latin American metropolis that at that time sort of embodied a new type of Latin American modernity at this level, so to speak. This was not matched by any other Latin American metropolis, not Mexico City, not Buenos Aires, to the same extent. The erection of these skyscrapers, the buildings, the architecture especially, and architecture, of course, was a kind of lead metaphor also for the poetry and also for the visual arts. So, architecture was a kind of paradigm. So in that sense, I think, at that time, Brazilian artists wanted to speed up and kind of project of themselves this kind of European image of themselves, or an image of a kind of new modernity that incorporated and surpassed the European model of modernity. This, of course, you might say, was a kind of self delusion or self-deception, that this was possible and that underdevelopment was not just a phase you had to go through, but it was a structural problem that haunts Latin America until today. So in that sense, this kind of self-deception to project this image of themselves as ahead of modernity from Latin America culminated at this particular place at this particular time. And that is, I think, different from what Colombia brought to world literature.
Yes. Thank you very much. Are there more questions on Zoom? Or here in the Eichstätt, we would have time for one more question. Yes, please, Feliciana.
I just one question, and thank you a lot for the presentation. I was wondering in which concrete ways was this movement coming to Europe, because you mentioned Forma, the architectural review, and that's a way, like, for example, Mexican muralism was writing this sort of Mexico through this review.
Yeah,
and
right.
Concrete way in which these artists made their way to Europe?
Thank you. I didn't quite understand. You mean how the Brazilians go to Europe, or how the European influence comes to Europe? I didn't quite understand.
Were coming in the Europe understanding, because as I understood
Yeah.
the way you were answering some questions,
Yeah.
they Europe kind of give importance to them recently and not at the time. But Pharma was at the time. So
Yeah, I mean, this I think exactly. I mean, these are two different things. That is to say, the journal Forma that you referenced was an Italian publication, and Cordeiro collaborated there and was part of the circle. So in that sense, Cordeiro is an example for someone who, even in Europe or with his European roots, just visits in Italy, frequent visits and contacts in the Italian art world, had already sort of a contact with concretism in Italy, and then sort of found these sort of resonances at the same time in Brazil. And of course, Italian concretism, was a really marginal phenomenon and was no longer than 2 years. I don't know. It did not reach the stature of Brazilian concretism, of course. But this is to show that even these sort of immigrant artists, they picked up something in the European after-war atmosphere and then brought it with them to Brazil, and then transformed it and then became big, so to speak. But it shows that there was a common atmosphere, a common desire to move away from academic styles of painting and writing in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. So in the 1950s, it's really interesting how these different things sort of echo one another and so forth. And then the second part, or the other aspect, is that, you know, later on, the European and especially also North American valuation of Brazilian concrete art, you know, set in the 1980s, with especially also with these correspondences with the Swiss and the Ulm schools of Gormedinger and so forth. I mean, there are several, you know, tendencies, both in poetry, think of the American poet William Carlos Williams, and so forth, where people in retrospect have recognized that, yes, you know, poems like this one with Coca-Cola are sort of extreme reductions of a poem, but in a sense, this extremism has helped people to see that visual poetry and the importance of space in poetry has always been part of poetry, not just in picture poetry, which of course also you can find in the 16th and 17th century sort of poetry that you know, imitates certain forms and so forth. But even the idea of, you know, arranging lines in a certain pattern and so forth is something that is very, I mean, that distinguishes poetry from other literary forms. So in retrospect, you know, after all this avant-garde noise has sort of dimmed down, you know, academics and critics and readers have recognized increasingly the not only discontinuities, the ruptures, but also the continuities and the commonalities that concrete poetry entertains with, you know, forms of lyrical poetry that seem to be completely different. So in that sense, I think it's an extremist form, but that sort of helps one to understand the nature of certain kinds of poetry. I don't know whether this answered your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much again, Jobst, for this talk and the discussion. I think we learned a lot, and yeah, thank you also to all of you who joined us, be it in Eichstätt, be it on Zoom, and have a nice evening or a nice afternoon in Bogota.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
So,
Ciao.
thank you much. Thank you very much.